Hi, this is Nancy with Red Leaf Digi-Scrapping. Thanks for joining me. This tutorial will show you how to digitally tear scrapbook paper to include on your digital scrapbook pages. The tutorial is being done in Photoshop Elements 4, but the same steps can be used in any version of Photoshop or Photoshop Elements. So to begin, I have a document started, and you'll see that I have two pieces of paper in it. In the layers palette here I have the background paper, and that's the piece of paper that's just going to stay in one piece. So that would be the background layer on your scrapbook page. The second layer is the torn paper layer, and this is the piece of paper that we're actually going to be tearing for the tutorial. So the first step is to create a duplicate layer of that torn paper. So to do that, in the layers palette, click anywhere in the area beside the name of the layer. The flyout menu will appear. Click on Duplicate Layer. And I'll just leave the name of the layer as Torn Paper Copy, so click on OK. Now I'm going to drag that layer down in between the torn paper and the background paper layers. And then next I'm going to reduce the opacity of it a little bit, and you'll see why in a minute. So we'll bring it down to 49. So because that layer is completely underneath the torn paper layer on top, you're not going to see any change just yet. Next, you want to make sure the top layer is selected, the torn paper, and what we're going to do is begin to tear the page. So you want to select the lasso tool, which is just a little ways down from the top on your toolbar here. And if you're actually showing the magnetic lasso tool or the polygonal lasso tool in your toolbar, just click on the icon and hold it down, and the flyout menu will appear that show you all three tools. So you can select the lasso tool from there. Next, what we're going to do is select the area of the paper that's going to be torn away. So I'm just going to start to draw a really rough edge, and you can just kind of wiggle the mouse back and forth a little bit, or use your pen if you have a tablet. And then come all the way down around, select the whole area that you want to tear away, and you'll see the marching ants appear around that area. And of course, making sure that the torn paper layer is the one that's selected in the layers palette. Hit delete. Now you'll see that that area of the paper has been torn away, and the torn paper copy, the layer underneath, it's faded out. So now you can see the difference between the two papers, and that's why we actually reduced the opacity, so that when we tore the first layer, you'd be able to see where it ended and where the next layer began. So I'm just going to deselect that area. And now we're going to do the same thing on the torn paper copy. So with the lasso tool still selected, you want to come down a little ways from where the tear on the top layer ends and repeat that same step. And don't worry if you're not following the line exactly, it'll actually look more realistic. Whoops, I lost my selection there. It'll actually look a bit more realistic if you have some wider areas in the tear and some narrow areas. So same thing, come all the way down, select the whole area, make sure that the copy layer now is selected, and hit delete to delete that area of your paper. And then I'm going to deselect that. Just going to widen my window a little bit here so I can zoom in and show you a bit more closely what I'm doing. Okay, so now that we have those two papers torn, I'm going to bring the opacity of that second layer back up to 100%. Okay, the next step is to reduce the color in that middle layer, the torn paper copy. Now to do that, come up to Enhance, click on Adjust Lighting, and then Brightness Contrast. Now if you're doing this tutorial in the full version of Photoshop, the brightness and contrast menu will be in a little different place in your menus, but you should be able to find it. Now what I'm going to do is increase the brightness. So I'm just going to slide the slider bar over to the right, and you'll see as I do this that second layer starts to turn white. Now when I tear my paper, I like to have a little bit of the pattern still showing. If you don't want to have the pattern showing, you can drag the slider bar all the way over to the right and your tear will just appear white. But I'm going to drag it back a little bit so that some of that pattern still shows through. And click on OK. The next thing we're going to do is add a little bit of texture to that tear, because usually you'll see a little bit of pulp and bumps in the area that gets torn away. So to do that, come up to the filter menu and click on texture and then texturizer. Now my texturizer is already set at the texture and the scale that I want, but this is something that you can experiment with a little bit. When I'm tearing paper, I like to use the sandstone texture, and then just slide the scaling slider bars around, and you'll see on the left hand side here the size of the texture will change, so it gives you a preview of what your texture is going to look like. I'm going to make it fairly large, and then do the same with the relief. So the relief is, you can see as I drag it here, it's just how strong or how soft the effect is going to be. So I'm choosing a relief of 9, but as I said, you can just kind of experiment and see what suits you. So once I have the texture set, click on OK, and I'll zoom back out a little bit here so you can see it's a fairly subtle texture. It's not too heavy. So now the last stage is just to rough up that edge a little bit. If you zoom in, you'll see that we've got some pretty distinct lines, but of course when you tear paper you end up with little bits of fiber and pulp that kind of come off the edges. So we're going to simulate that. So starting with the torn paper copy layer selected, come over to your eraser tool, which is right here. Now we're going to select a certain brush to do this. So click on the brush selector arrow, and in the default brushes, about 2/3 of the way down, you'll find a brush called Grass. That's the brush that we're going to use to create the look of the fiber and the pulp at the edge of the tear. So select that brush. Now when the brush comes in, it's pretty large, it's 134 pixels. So I want to reduce that size quite a bit because I want a fairly subtle effect. So I'm going to bring the size down to about 18. So now you can see on the screen here my brush has become quite small. Now what I'm going to do is just start erasing the edges. So you'll need to position the edge of the paper about in the middle of the brush as you go, and just go back and forth and just start erasing that edge. And you'll see now, even though you can still see the edge of your tear, it's much softer, and it'll end up giving you a much more realistic looking tear. So just go all the way along and erase that edge. I'm just doing a very small bit here just to give you the idea. And then once you've done that, click on the top layer, the torn paper layer, and do the same on that layer. Just go all the way across, and you can see the effect coming in even better on the top layer. So you no longer have those defined lines. You've got a nice fibery, pulpy looking tear. So I'm just going to finish going across here and softening up that line. Okay, so I'm going to zoom back out, and you'll see my tear is looking pretty realistic. Now the last step is just to add a little bit of a drop shadow just to separate the torn paper from the background paper a little bit. So to do that, come over to your torn paper copy, the middle layer, and down in your Styles and Effects palette, under Layer Styles, you want to select Drop Shadows, and double click on Low to give a low drop shadow. Now this is much too large for what the effect that I'm trying to get. So up in the Layers palette, you'll see that you now have a layer style, this little S, stylized S, showing up at the side of your layer style. Double click on that and it'll bring up your style settings. Now this will let you actually reduce the size of that shadow. So just by sliding the slider bar over to the left, we're going to bring the size of the shadow down pretty much all the way. Click on OK, and now you'll see that the shadow is much more subtle. but it just gives that little bit of lift and separation to the torn paper. Now as a final step, you'll want to just merge those layers together so that they don't get separated in case you have to move things around. So with the torn paper copy selected, hold down your Shift key and click on the torn paper copy, or torn paper layer, sorry, and you'll see they both show up in blue, and then right click, click on merge layers, and you now have one layer that's the torn paper layer. So I can now pick that up and move it around as one piece. And that is how to digitally tear your paper. Thanks for joining me.